What happens when Hollywood's brightest lights burn out and nobody cares? Imagine reaching the pinnacle of fame, only to vanish into obscurity while the world barely notices you're gone. Why do some of the biggest stars end up as tragic headlines or, worse, footnotes nobody remembers? Stick around, because today we're pulling back the red velvet curtain on the cruelest magic trick the Dream Factory ever pulled, turning legends into ghosts. Ready to see who Hollywood left behind? Let's get uncomfortable. Marie Provost. Marie Provost was once the toast of Tinseltown. Think red carpets, magazine covers, and a paycheck most bankers would envy. She could light up a room with her charm, and studios lined up to put her in their next big picture. But Hollywood, as always, is a tough crowd. When talkies arrived, Marie's career stumbled. Her voice wasn't special enough for the new age, and worse, she gained weight in a town where gaining a pound might as well be a criminal offense. The industry that once begged for her presence suddenly ghosted her. No calls, no invites, just the deafening silence of a city that loves you when you're up and forgets you exist when you're down. Marie's spiral was brutal. Desperate to win back her career, she resorted to starvation diets and alcohol, a deadly combo. Her loyal dachshund was her only company, and even he suffered when the world stopped caring. On January 21, 1937, Marie was found dead in her tiny Hollywood apartment. She'd been gone for 2 days before anyone noticed. The cause? Officially, acute alcoholism, but the heartbreaking rumor was she'd starved herself, holding out for one last call that never came. Even her dog tried in vain to wake her. In the end, Marie Provost became a cautionary tale Hollywood refused to remember, her story whispered only in the margins of history books, a bright light snuffed out by indifference. Peg Antwistle. You know that famous Hollywood sign? Once upon a time, it read Hollywoodland, and it became the stage for one of showbiz's most haunting stories. Peg Entwistle wasn't just another face chasing the dream. She was a legit Broadway star, talented and hungry for a new life on the silver screen. But in a town that chews up hope for breakfast, her dream unraveled fast. Signed to a contract at RKO, Peg appeared in just one film, 13 Women. Most of her scenes got chopped in the editing room. Suddenly, the offers stopped. In Hollywood, your last gig is your only gig, and hers barely counted. Alone and shut out, Peg climbed Mount Lee and jumped from the H in the Hollywoodland sign. She left a note. I am afraid I am a coward. I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain. Here's the cruelest twist. 3 days after her death, a letter arrived at her uncle's house, offering her a starring role in a play about a woman driven to self-destruction. Peg never knew her comeback was in the mail. Instead, she became a ghostly legend. Her story, a monument to broken promises and the razor-thin line between fame and despair. Next time you see that sign, remember that Hollywood's brightest dreams cast the longest shadows. John Gilbert. John Gilbert was Hollywood's original great lover, a man whose on-screen kisses made audiences swoon and whose real-life romance with Greta Garbo set off more fireworks than a 4th of July parade. He was once one of the highest-paid actors on Earth. But when talking pictures rolled in, John found himself at the mercy of the world's pettiest rumor mill. Studio bosses, allegedly including the infamous Louis B. Mayer, spread the word that John's voice was all wrong for talkies. Truth? His voice was perfectly fine, but Hollywood loves a good takedown, especially when it saves them money. The real goal was to break Gilbert's expensive contract, and a few whispers in the right ears were all it took to make audiences laugh when they should have swooned. The ridicule ate away at him. Once the king of romance, John started drinking to dull the pain. Alone in his mansion, surrounded by trophies and echoes, he became a recluse. On January 9, 1936, John died of a heart attack at just 38. Some say it was booze, some say it was stress, but everyone close to him agreed. He died of a broken heart, abandoned by an industry that couldn't stand to see him win. Years later, film historians finally proved his voice was fine. By then, it was too late. The lesson? In Hollywood, talent is never enough if the suits want you gone. The great lover was left with nothing but memories and the bitter knowledge that he'd been played by the house. Barbara Lamar. Barbara Lamar wasn't just beautiful, she was too beautiful, according to the studios, and that label came with a price. Her looks were legendary. Photographers tripped over themselves for a picture, and moviegoers couldn't get enough. She lived faster than anyone around her, burning through marriages, affairs, and parties like tomorrow was optional. But behind the glamour was a woman who couldn't slow down, even when her health collapsed under the pressure. The studios loved her box office magic but hated her wild lifestyle. To rein her in, they cut her roles and tried to force her into line. Barbara's answer? More parties, less sleep, and every dangerous diet and stimulant you can imagine. In 1925, she was seriously ill but refused to stop working or partying. By January 30th, 1926, Barbara collapsed on a film set and died later that day. The official cause, acute nephritis, her kidneys giving out after years of abuse. She was just 29. No family sat by her hospital bed. Her husband was away, her children with relatives, and her so-called friends were too busy to care. Barbara Lamar died utterly alone. The ultimate Hollywood punchline for a woman they said was too much for this world. The reality? She was just too real for an industry built on smoke, mirrors, and manufactured innocence. Her story is a flashing warning light for anyone who thinks beauty is enough to save you in the city of angels. Wallace Reed. Wallace Reed was everything a Hollywood leading man should be. Tall, athletic, impossibly handsome, and a natural in front of the camera. Studios showered him with roles, fans flooded theaters, and his image sold 1,000 movie tickets a minute. But nobody saw the pain he carried after a train accident left him with chronic agony and a prescription for morphine, courtesy of the studio's own doctors. What started as treatment quickly became a weapon. Studios figured out that an addicted star was a controllable star. Need more energy? Give him stimulants. Can't sleep? Pass the downers. Wallace became a lab experiment for the production schedule, spiraling deeper into dependence while the cameras kept rolling. His wife, Dorothy Davenport, watched her husband fade, powerless to help as the system squeezed every last dollar from his declining body. If she intervened, they threatened to blacklist him. By 1922, Wallace could barely function, collapsing on set, forgetting lines, shaking uncontrollably. But Hollywood didn't care, as long as the dailies looked good. The end was as lonely as it was inevitable. Found unconscious in his dressing room, Wallace was rushed to a sanitarium, but it was too late. Officially, he died of influenza, but everyone knew the real cause. Hollywood's golden boy was destroyed by the very system that made him. He died alone, abandoned by an industry that saw him as just another broken tool on the cutting room floor. Olive Thomas. Olive Thomas was the original flapper, a Ziegfeld Follies darling with a mischievous smile and a wild streak. She had it all: looks, talent, a high-profile marriage to Jack Pickford, yes, Mary Pickford's little brother, and a string of hit films that made her America's sweetheart. But even sweethearts get chewed up in Hollywood's machinery. By 1920, Olive's marriage was in shambles, rocked by Jack's gambling, partying, and heavy substance abuse. They fled to Paris for a second honeymoon, but instead of romance, the trip devolved into bitter fights and bad decisions. Alone and exhausted in a Paris hotel, Olive accidentally ingested a fatal dose of mercury bichloride, medicine for Jack, but deadly for her. The official line was accident, but gossip swirled about everything from suicide to something darker. Olive's last moments were spent in agony, thousands of miles from home, with her husband nowhere in sight. The girl who once lit up Broadway and the silent screen died in a foreign land. Her story reduced to headlines and scandal. Her death at just 25 set off shockwaves in Hollywood. But the industry quickly moved on. There was always another ingenue ready to step in. For all her fame, Olive Thomas ended up as just another tragic footnote. Her final days remembered more for tabloid drama than her undeniable talent. In Hollywood, even legends can disappear overnight, and sometimes the saddest stories are the ones that fade away the fastest. Jean Eagles. Jean Eagles wasn't just another pretty face. She was a once-in-a-generation Broadway genius. Her performance in Rain was so electric, people lined up around the block just to catch a glimpse of her on stage. When she brought that magic to Hollywood, the studios expected a goldmine. But what they got was a storm. Brilliant, unpredictable, and impossible to control. Hollywood's ironclad schedules and Jean's fiercely independent temperament were a disastrous mix. She'd miss call times, vanish for days, or arrive unprepared. The studios didn't see a tortured artist. They saw a problem, offers dried up, and the town that once worshipped her talent now treated her like damaged goods. Her personal life was chaos. Jean struggled with addiction, heartbreak, and a sense that no one could possibly understand her battles. By the late 1920s, she was a shadow of her former self. Her genius, as undeniable as her pain, was unmanageable. On October 3, 1929, Jean was found dead in her New York apartment. Officially, it was alcohol and substance-related complications. Unofficially, it was the slow burn of a world that didn't know what to do with someone so incandescent iridescent and so human. Jean Eagle's legacy is that of brilliance and a warning. In an industry obsessed with control, anyone who colors outside the lines is at risk of being erased. For all her ovations, she died with no audience, alone in the city that had once cheered her name. Alma Rubin's. Alma Rubin's was the kind of beauty you'd swear was invented for silent film, delicate, ethereal, the picture of tragic romance. She starred in dozens of films, often as the doomed heroine, and audiences couldn't get enough. But behind the screen goddess image was a real woman struggling to keep her head above water in a town built on quicksand. Alma's life off camera was a train wreck of bad decisions and worse luck. She got tangled up with all the wrong people, friends who exploited her and introduced her to the hard stuff. Substance abuse became her prison, and in Hollywood, mercy is in short supply. Once she started missing calls and losing jobs, directors dropped her, and the A-list party invites evaporated overnight. She fought to clean up her act, landing occasional roles, but Hollywood has a long memory for trouble and a short one for talent. The cycle of relapse and redemption kept spinning until Alma was broke, friendless, and hanging on by a thread. On January 22, 1931, she died in a Los Angeles hospital at just 33, the official story being pneumonia. But everyone knew the real headline, another star, destroyed by addiction and abandonment. Alma Rubin's story is Hollywood's dark fairy tale. A beautiful woman, loved on the screen, erased off it. She spent her final days alone, her talent forgotten, her legacy left to fade like old celluloid. If you ever doubt the cost of chasing dreams in Hollywood, remember Alma's face, and how quickly even the brightest stars can be left in the dark. Mabel Normant. Mabel Normant was one of the original comedy queens, a slapstick dynamo who could make audiences roar without uttering a word. She was a star, a director, and a trailblazer for women in early Hollywood. But for every pie she threw on screen, she got a brick in real life, and those hits left marks you couldn't see. Mabel's name got dragged into two of Hollywood's nastiest scandals: the murder of William Desmond Taylor and the Fatty Arbuckle debacle. She was never charged and never found guilty, but in Hollywood, guilt by association is a death sentence. Studios slammed the doors shut, society friends crossed her off guest lists, and the press turned her into a cautionary tale. She fought to come back, landing a few roles here and there, but the big money was gone, and so was her health. Tuberculosis, made worse by addiction, was a ticking time bomb. On February 23, 1930, she died in a Monrovia sanitarium at just 37, with nobody but the nurses by her side. The woman who made millions laugh spent her last days as a footnote, a punchline to a joke no one wanted to hear. Mabel Normant's fall wasn't about talent. It was about timing, scandal, and a town that eats its wounded. Her legacy? She helped invent Hollywood comedy, but was forgotten by the same industry she'd helped build. Sometimes, the saddest punchlines aren't jokes. They're what's left unsaid after the credits roll. Clara Bo. Clara Bo was the original It girl, the flapper goddess who embodied everything wild, rebellious, and irresistible about the Roaring Twenties. Hollywood adored her for being real, relatable, and just a little bit dangerous. She didn't act, she exploded on screen. But fame can be a trickster, and nobody learned that lesson harder than Clara. Born into grinding poverty and chaos, Clara never shook the trauma of her early years. Even as her star rose, the past haunted her. Hollywood's transition to talkies wasn't her downfall. Her voice was fine, but the gossip mill never stopped grinding. Scandals, real and invented, dogged her every move. When her secretary embezzled her money and sold stories to the tabloids, the resulting storm forced Clara to retire at her peak. She spent her later years far from the spotlight, living as a recluse on a Nevada ranch, hiding from both the press and her own painful memories. The woman who once defined American youth vanished from the public eye, never returning to Hollywood or her former life. When Clara Bo died on September 27, 1965, at 60, she was almost entirely forgotten. The original It girl, the face on every billboard, had become a ghost in her own story. Her tragedy isn't just about loss, it's about how quickly this industry moves on when you're no longer useful, no matter how brightly you once shined. Rudolph Valentino. Rudolph Valentino was the ultimate silent-era heartthrob. He didn't just break hearts, he started full-blown hysteria. When he walked down the street, fans fainted. At his movies, people lined up for blocks. But under the surface, Hollywood's great lover was lonelier than anyone suspected. Despite all the fame, Valentino was perpetually short on cash. Bad business deals, legal battles, and 2 expensive divorces left him struggling to pay the bills. And behind the silver screen allure, he was physically suffering. Doctors couldn't figure out why he was always in pain. In August 1926, Valentino collapsed in his New York hotel room. The diagnosis, a perforated ulcer. The treatment, agony. During his final days, he was surrounded by reporters and rubberneckers, not friends. His ex-wives didn't come. His colleagues sent flowers but stayed away. As his body failed, the only company he had was the endless sound of strangers talking about him in the hallway. When he died on August 23, 1926, at just 31, the world went wild with grief, but not for the man, only for the myth. His funeral was a circus, but in those final moments, Rudolph was utterly alone. He was proof that you can be adored by millions and still die a stranger to everyone who matters. If Hollywood is a dream machine, Valentino's ending is the nightmare nobody wants to wake up to, a reminder that the limelight doesn't keep you warm when the house lights go down. John Barrymore. John Barrymore was acting royalty, the most famous member of America's first family of stage and screen. He was a legend in his own lifetime, tackling Shakespeare and screwball comedies with equal style, charming crowds with a voice and presence that seemed unstoppable. But what Hollywood gives, it can snatch away in a heartbeat, and John's downfall was as legendary as his rise. Barrymore's love affairs were tabloid gold. His drinking became folklore, and his wild streak was matched only by his talent. In an era when everyone drank, John drank harder. Directors started giving him cue cards when his memory slipped. Then teleprompters. Eventually, even those couldn't save him. When the studios decided he was no longer bankable, the offers dried up faster than last night's gin. In his final years, Barrymore was reduced to bit parts and radio parodies of his former self, essentially being paid to mock the legend he once was. The great profile spent his last days broke, ill, and mocked by the same industry that once worshipped him. On May 29, 1942, he died of kidney failure and cirrhosis at 60, alone in a hospital bed, surrounded not by fans or family, but by silence. Barrymore's end is a Hollywood fable in reverse. From crown prince to pauper, from headliner to has-been. His life was a high-wire act. His final act was a devastating plunge. In Tinseltown, even the brightest marquee names can flicker out, leaving nothing behind but stories whispered in the wings. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake was a living trend. Her peekaboo hairstyle was so iconic that it practically required its own agent. She was Hollywood's go-to femme fatale in the 1940s, her smoky eyes and mysterious aura filling theaters and magazine pages. But when trends shifted, the girl behind the curtain was left to face the music, and it was anything but glamorous. Lake's struggles with alcohol and erratic behavior became a Hollywood legend. She was difficult to work with, yes, but that never stopped the town from embracing its bad boys. For women, the rules were different. Lake became trouble, and roles dried up overnight. Her signature hairstyle fell out of fashion, and so did she. By the 1950s, the former silver screen siren was working as a cocktail waitress in New York, recognized only occasionally by patrons who'd once idolized her. Each recognition stung, a reminder of how far she'd fallen and how quickly the world forgets. Veronica drifted from one cheap apartment to another, her health deteriorating, her options vanishing like old newsprint. When she died in 1973 of hepatitis and kidney failure, she was just 50, isolated and broke. Her glory days are a distant, flickering memory. Veronica Lake's vanishing act wasn't performed on stage, but in real life, where there's no applause and no second take. Hollywood loves a mystery, but it hates a comeback, especially when the star is a woman who refuses to fade quietly. George Sanders. George Sanders had a voice like velvet over a razor blade, perfect for the world-weary villains and cads he played to Oscar-winning perfection. He was Addison DeWitt in All About Eve, the perfect blend of charm and acid wit. But beneath the cool exterior, George was spiraling. His cynicism wasn't just an act. He outlived his friends, burned through his money, and watched as Hollywood's golden days faded to black and white reruns. Failed marriages, bad investments, and failing health pushed Sanders deeper into disillusionment. He was losing his hearing, his instrument, his identity, and the phone wasn't ringing like it used to. In 1972, George Sanders checked into a hotel in Spain, penned a note, "Dear world, I am leaving because I am bored," and swallowed a fatal dose of sleeping pills. There was no dramatic last stand, no gathering of friends or fans. Just a quiet exit, far from the spotlight. In his own sardonic way, George got the last word, but it was a word spoken to an empty room. He left the world with its worries and walked off stage for good, leaving only a bitter punchline behind. George Sanders' final act proved even the most sophisticated cynic can be undone by the very emptiness he once mocked. Hollywood loves to write scripts, but some endings nobody sees coming. Gail Russell. Gail Russell looked like she stepped straight out of a dream, soft-spoken, porcelain-skinned, with those haunted eyes that made her perfect for ghost stories and gothic romances. She became a star almost by accident, discovered while working as a restaurant hostess. But behind the otherworldly aura was a crippling anxiety she couldn't escape. Every shot was torture. The spotlight terrified her, and to numb her stage fright, she started drinking, a coping strategy that quickly turned into a career-ending addiction. Studios initially tried to help, sending her to rehab, but Hollywood's patience is paper-thin. As her reliability plummeted, so did her opportunities. Directors stopped calling, friends disappeared, fame vanished, replaced by a shadow. By her early 30s, Gail was living alone in a modest Hollywood apartment, surviving on scraps of unemployment and the rare bit part. On August 27, 1961, she was found dead, having choked in an alcohol-related accident. She was only 36, no final gathering, no red carpet, just silence and a stack of unpaid bills. Gail Russell's story isn't just sad. It's a haunting reminder of what happens when a shy soul is tossed to the wolves. Hollywood can take a quiet girl and turn her into a myth. But when the cameras stop rolling, sometimes the only thing left is the ghost. Lupe Velez was Hollywood dynamite. Nicknamed the Mexican Spitfire, she brought fire, flair, and chaos to everything she did, on and off the screen. Her romances with the likes of Gary Cooper were legendary, her temper notorious, and her performances unforgettable. But being unforgettable isn't always enough to save you when the scripts and the world move on. By the 1940s, Hollywood's taste for ethnic types was fading, and Lupe's career prospects dimmed. Add a string of messy relationships and looming financial trouble, and her world started to unravel. The final blow came with an unplanned pregnancy and a lover, Harold Ramond, who refused to marry her. In an era obsessed with scandal, there was little room for single mothers, especially women of color. On December 13, 1944, Lupe Velez died alone in her Beverly Hills home after a mixture of pills and alcohol. Her attempt at a movie star exit turned tragic, and her death became fodder for endless jokes and rumors. The reality was far from glamorous. The Spitfire who had set Hollywood ablaze was gone, her memory reduced to scandal sheet headlines. Lupe Velez's legacy isn't just about her roles or her tempestuous life. It's about how quickly a legend can be reduced to a punchline. In Hollywood, it's easy to be unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. The real tragedy? Sometimes even the fire can burn out in silence. Landis. Carol Landis wasn't just a blonde bombshell. She was Hollywood's sweetheart during World War II, crisscrossing the globe to entertain the troops and bringing sunshine wherever she went. But even the brightest stars can cast the darkest shadows. Beneath Carol's public persona was a woman quietly crumbling under disappointment, heartbreak, and the relentless grind of chasing validation in Tinseltown. Her private life was a revolving door of failed marriages and disastrous affairs, the most notorious being her love for Rex Harrison. Harrison kept promising to leave his wife for Carol, but never did. Landis was left dangling, both emotionally and professionally. By 1948, her career was stalling, her finances were dwindling, and her romantic hopes were smashed to pieces. On July 5, 1948, Carol Landis was found dead in her Pacific Palisades home, a victim of a barbiturate overdose. The world learned the news through headlines, no happy endings, just a tragic punchline. She'd left behind a stack of love letters, a shattered Hollywood fantasy, and a cautionary tale nobody in the business wanted to discuss. Rex Harrison? He was having dinner with his wife the night Carol died. For all her charisma and goodwill, Carol died alone. Her smile remembered, but her loneliness was mostly ignored. In the end, Hollywood's blonde bombshell was just another name crossed off the guest list. She was living proof that sometimes the most dazzling people are hiding the deepest wounds. Alan Ladd. Alan Ladd was the strong, silent type, literally. He stood just over 5 feet tall but cast a giant shadow as Hollywood's tough guy, starring in classics like Shane. Ladd's intensity on screen was legendary, but away from the cameras, he was plagued by insecurity, chronic pain, and a creeping sense that he'd never truly fit in. Hollywood hid his short stature with clever camera tricks, but nothing could mask his private battles. Ladd relied on alcohol and sedatives to cope with the stress and exhaustion, and as the years wore on, those crutches became a prison. By the 1960s, he found himself in the shadow of younger, fresher faces. The phone stopped ringing. The world moved on. On January 29, 1964, Alan Ladd was found dead in his Palm Springs home, officially an accidental overdose, but many whispered about depression and heartbreak. He was only 50, his family was nearby, but in that final moment, Ladd was on his own, his pain drowned out by the very silence that made him a star. Alan Ladd's life was proof that even the strongest heroes can be brought down by the battles nobody else sees. In the end, his legacy wasn't just about cowboy grit. It was a cautionary echo in the canyon of fame. The silence that made him famous was the same silence that swallowed him whole. Inger Stevens. Inger Stevens looked like she had it all, a stunning Swedish actress who conquered both television and film in the 1950s and 60s. Audiences fell for her instantly, charmed by her poise, her wit, and that almost ethereal presence on screen. But behind her dazzling smile was a private agony that few ever suspected. Inger's childhood was marked by abandonment and abuse. Despite her success, she never quite shook the feeling that she didn't belong. Her relationships were a series of heartbreaks and breakdowns. She married secretly, struggled to keep up the facade of Hollywood perfection, and found herself typecast as the fragile woman, on screen and off. Even as the offers rolled in, Inger felt isolated. Her closest confidants reported wild mood swings and periods of crushing loneliness. She tried to keep up appearances, but the cracks showed. On April 30th, 1970, Inger was found dead in her Hollywood Hills home, the victim of a barbiturate overdose. The official cause was suicide, though some insisted it was accidental. Inger Stevens was just 35, and her promising career and life were cut short by inner turmoil the world never truly saw. She died alone, leaving behind a legacy of roles that glimmered with the sadness she carried every day. Her story is a reminder that you never really know what battles someone is fighting, even if they're smiling on every magazine cover. Jean Harlo. Jean Harlo was the original bombshell, the platinum blonde, whose smoldering looks and zippy one-liners defined an era. She was as close to Hollywood royalty as you could get in the 1930s, with a screen presence that turned every film into an event. But stardom came at a brutal price, and Jean paid it in full. Harlo's life was marred by scandal and heartbreak. Her second husband died under mysterious circumstances, and gossip columnists never let her forget it. Beneath the glamour, Jean suffered from chronic kidney disease, a diagnosis the studios tried to hide. Instead of allowing her time to heal, they pushed her to keep working, desperate to milk every last dollar from their golden girl before the inevitable. Jean kept up a punishing schedule, ignoring the pain. By 26, her body couldn't keep up. On June 7, 1937, she died of kidney failure, the studio machine already searching for her replacement before the funeral flowers wilted. She passed away in her mother's arms, but the battle was hers alone. Hollywood's support vanished the second her box office value did. Jean Harlo's death was both a tragedy and a warning. In an industry built on youth and beauty, the clock is always ticking. Even the platinum blonde could be worked to death, and the applause fades long before the credits do. She was a star whose light was devoured by the very system that made her shine. Susan Peters. Susan Peters was the kind of actress who made you believe in happy endings, a fresh face, radiant talent, and an Oscar nomination for Random Harvest. She was on her way to the top when tragedy struck in the unlikeliest of ways. One New Year's Day, a hunting accident left her paralyzed from the waist down, her entire future upended in a single brutal moment. Peters refused to give up. She worked tirelessly to reinvent herself, starring in films and a TV series from a wheelchair, determined to prove Hollywood wrong. But the industry wasn't ready for a disabled leading lady. Roles dried up, opportunities vanished, and her marriage, already strained, collapsed under the weight of her new reality. Left to navigate the world alone, Susan struggled financially and emotionally. Alcohol became her solace, isolation her prison. On October 23, 1952, at just 31, Susan Peters died from complications of chronic kidney disease, her body weakened by paralysis and years of neglect. There was no dramatic final scene, just a quiet exit from a stage that had never been designed to support her in the first place. Susan's story is one of both resilience and heartbreak. Hollywood likes to celebrate its miracles, but it rarely sticks around for its tragedies. Peters was a shooting star whose potential was never fully realized, not because she lacked talent, but because the industry couldn't see beyond her limitations. In the end, she died alone, a casualty of circumstance and a business with no patience for imperfection. Marie Macdonald. Marie Macdonald was the Body Beautiful, a nickname that tells you everything about how Hollywood valued her. Blonde, curvy, and impossibly photogenic, She was a pin-up queen during the 1940s, gracing covers and movie posters everywhere. But all that beauty was just a veneer covering a world of chaos and heartbreak. Marie's life was a mess of broken marriages, bad choices, and shady characters. Her career never quite matched her looks, and that gnawing dissatisfaction led her down a path of addiction and paranoia. She became infamous for her wild stories. At one point, she even claimed to have been kidnapped, though police were never convinced. As the years went by, she bounced between hospitals, rehab centers, and a revolving door of husbands. When the calls from studios stopped and her fame faded, Marie was left with little more than her reputation and a mountain of regrets. On October 21, 1965, she was found dead in her Calabasas home from an overdose of prescription meds. She was just 42, completely alone, her Hollywood dreams as faded as the old pinups that once made her a star. Marie Macdonald's story is a reminder that fame can be a trap disguised as a gift. She was adored for her looks, forgotten for her struggles, and ultimately left to face her demons by herself. In Hollywood, beauty opens doors, but it won't keep them from slamming shut. Barbara Payton. Barbara Payton lived fast, loved recklessly, and refused to apologize for either. She was the bad girl's bad girl, a femme fatale both on and off the screen, with a headline-making life to match. Studios chased her for her raw talent and magnetic presence, but behind the glamour was a woman always at war with herself and the world. Her Hollywood career rocketed with roles in films like Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, but what really kept Barbara's name in the papers were her torrid affairs with married men, her connection to underworld figures, and an endless supply of scandals. As her reputation grew wilder, studio execs started whispering liability. Once directors stopped calling, the descent was swift. Barbara spiraled into addiction, poverty, and eventually survival on the fringes of society. Her final years were a tabloid's dream, but a human nightmare, living in cheap hotels, sometimes on the streets, doing whatever it took to get by. On May 8, 1967, Barbara Payton died alone of heart and liver failure in San Diego, just 39 years old. Gone was the silver screen goddess, replaced by an invisible woman lost in her own city. Barbara Payton's story is proof that Hollywood loves a bad girl, but only for as long as she's profitable. After that, she's just another cautionary tale whispered in the wings, her fame outlasted only by her infamy, and the memory of a star who truly burned at both ends. Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge should have had it all. With her magnetic beauty and powerful voice, she became the first African-American woman nominated for a Best Actress Oscar, stunning audiences in Carmen Jones. She kicked open doors that had been shut tight for decades, but the party on the other side wasn't for her. Hollywood, still stuck in its own prejudices, only allowed Dorothy into certain roles. She was typecast, tokenized, and paid far less than her white counterparts. When she wasn't starring in second-rate productions, she was fighting just to keep her career afloat. Add to that a tumultuous personal life, a daughter born with severe brain damage, financial chaos, failed marriages, and Dorothy's golden years were anything but. By the 1960s, Dandridge was essentially blacklisted by the major studios, deeply in debt and emotionally exhausted. Her final years were marked by heartbreak, isolation, and a sense that her groundbreaking talent was wasted by an industry not ready for her brilliance. On September 8, 1965, Dorothy was found dead in her West Hollywood apartment from an overdose of antidepressants. She was just 42, facing bankruptcy and utterly alone. Dorothy Dandridge's life wasn't just a story of broken barriers. It was a lesson in how slow change can kill a spirit. Hollywood hailed her as a pioneer, then left her behind when the applause faded. Her legacy lives on, but her end remains one of the industry's most shameful losses. Bobby Driscoll. Bobby Driscoll was the very definition of child star magic. The first boy ever signed to a personal contract by Disney, he was the face and voice of Peter Pan, and starred in hits like Treasure Island. Millions adored his innocent charm. But Hollywood has never been a playground for long, and Bobby's fairy tale ended hard. As he grew up, his voice changed, his boyish looks faded, and suddenly, Disney didn't need him anymore. The job offers dried up, and Bobby found himself out in the cold, struggling to adjust to a world that had only valued him as a kid. With no adult roles and few skills outside of show business, he turned to drugs to fill the growing void. His descent was heartbreaking. From Oscar winner to vagrant, arrested for possession, then ultimately living on the streets of New York City. By the time he died, alone, in an abandoned building at just 31, It took weeks for anyone to even notice he was gone. Bobby Driscoll was buried in a pauper's grave, unclaimed and unmissed by the very industry that once built its empire on his smile. His story is a brutal reminder that in Hollywood, youth is currency, and nobody cares about your second act. Bobby Driscoll was a lost boy who grew up, only to find the Neverland he'd been promised didn't exist. Lana Turner. Lana Turner was the sweater girl, Hollywood's golden goddess and a box office sensation for decades. Her sultry looks and magnetic presence made her one of the biggest stars of the 1940s and 50s. Scandal was her shadow, from multiple marriages to the infamous Johnny Stompanato affair, but for years, she always landed on her feet. But glamour is a game with an unforgiving timer. As Lana aged, the roles dried up. The industry she helped define moved on, trading yesterday's icons for tomorrow's ingenues. Her love life, 8 marriages, and countless heartbreaks became more fodder for tabloids than for scripts. Friends vanished, opportunities disappeared, and Turner found herself isolated in a Century City condo, the phone silent, the fan mail all but gone. By the time she died in 1995 at age 74, Lana Turner was mostly a memory, her last years spent in seclusion, her health failing, her fortune nearly gone. The world that once worshipped her barely noticed her passing. The sweater girl had become invisible, a living relic of an era nobody wanted to remember. Lana Turner's story is Hollywood in a nutshell. Fame as fleeting as a flashbulb, loyalty as shallow as a studio pool. She was a legend who learned too late that the only thing more brutal than Hollywood's rise is its indifference on the way down. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was the king of adventure, the devil-may-care hero who brought Robin Hood and Captain Blood to life. Off-screen, he lived even larger, parties, romances, and more trouble than a fleet of pirates. But Tinseltown's greatest swashbuckler couldn't outrun time, and his final adventure was no Hollywood ending. Years of hard living, booze, wild affairs, and non-stop drama caught up with him by the 1950s. The dashing good looks faded, the roles stopped coming, and Flynn's charm couldn't mask the damage. Financial disasters followed, and his reputation for unreliability sealed his fate with the studios. Even his relationships with his children grew distant as he drifted from one faded project to the next. Flynn died of a heart attack in Vancouver in 1959, just 50 years old, almost unrecognizable from his matinee idol days. He was broke, far from the Hollywood that once bowed at his feet, surrounded by strangers rather than friends. His legendary life ended not in applause, but in silence and obscurity. Errol Flynn's story is a warning shot for every star who thinks the party never ends. Hollywood loves a bad boy, right up until he stops being useful. For Flynn, the only thing bigger than his legend was the silence that swallowed it when the lights finally went out. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift was a revelation, a brooding, naturalistic actor who changed the way men looked and sounded on screen. His roles in classics like A Place in the Sun and From Here to Eternity set a new standard for intensity and realism. But while his career soared, his personal life was a storm of secrets, pain, and isolation. Clift was tormented by his sexuality at a time when being openly gay could destroy a career. He numbed the anxiety with pills and booze, spiraling deeper after a horrific car crash in 1956 left his face scarred and his confidence shattered. The studios grew impatient as his performances became erratic, and his reputation for being difficult took hold. Even his closest friends struggled to break through the walls he built around himself. By the 1960s, Clift was a ghost in his own home, venturing out only when he had to. He turned down more roles than he accepted, not out of pride, but out of fear. On July 23, 1966, Montgomery Clift died of a heart attack in his New York apartment, alone, just 45 years old, surrounded not by accolades but by silence. His life was a masterclass in intensity, his end a study in loneliness. In the end, Clift's genius wasn't enough to save him from Hollywood's cruelty or his own private demons. He left behind films that still inspire actors today, but his final act was played out in an empty room, the curtain falling on a legend no one saw coming. William Desmond Taylor. William Desmond Taylor had it all. The respect of his peers, a string of successful films, and the kind of social calendar that would make even today's A-listers jealous. He directed the biggest names, lived among the stars, and seemed untouchable. But the real Hollywood doesn't believe in fairy tale endings, especially when there's a scandal to cover up. In February 1922, Taylor's valet found him dead in his study, shot in the back. Cue the Hollywood cover-up machine. Studio executives and neighbors scrambled to sanitize the crime scene before the police even showed up, removing anything that might embarrass the brand. In the end, the industry cared more about protecting its own image than about solving the murder of one of its brightest talents. The investigation revealed a web of affairs, threats, and secrets, all tidied up and swept under the rug. And Taylor? He died surrounded by people who claimed to love him, but in reality, no one was there when it truly mattered. His killer was never caught. Many suspect the bigwigs at Paramount actively squashed the case to keep the skeletons in their own closets. William Desmond Taylor's death is still unsolved, a cold case buried beneath decades of Hollywood legend and convenient amnesia. He was more than a victim of violence. He was a casualty of an industry that values reputation over justice. You think today's scandals are wild? Hollywood's been playing this game for a long, long time. Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer didn't fit the Hollywood mold. She smashed it. Brilliant, rebellious, and politically outspoken, Frances was a rising star who refused to play by the rules. She challenged studio contracts, shunned the press, and took roles she actually cared about. That made her a problem, and Hollywood has never been kind to problems. Her troubles started when her outspokenness collided with studio bosses and her own personal demons. Frances was brilliant, but struggled with mental health and addiction at a time when compassion was rare and understanding even rarer. After a series of erratic public appearances and some very public meltdowns, the studios washed their hands off her. Her family, under pressure, had her institutionalized, a nightmare of forced treatments, isolation, and infamy. The once celebrated actress spent 7 years in various institutions, enduring brutal therapies that left her a ghost of her former self. When Frances was finally released, she tried to rebuild a life in quiet anonymity, working as a hotel desk clerk, far from the Hollywood spotlight, but the system had already broken her spirit. Frances Farmer died on August 1, 1982, at 68, largely forgotten except by a handful of diehard fans and conspiracy theorists. She was a comet, fiery, brilliant, and destined to burn out far too soon. In the end, her greatest role wasn't on screen, but as the cautionary tale for what happens to anyone who dares tell Hollywood no. So, what does it mean when legends vanish? Their names echoing only in old film reels and whispered Hollywood gossip. Maybe it's a warning that in this town, fame is a rental, not a reward. But now you know their stories, and that's one way the dream never dies. Which name surprised you most? Drop your thoughts below, hit like, subscribe for more, and share this video to keep these legends alive. Hollywood forgot them. We won't.